Welcome to another episode of The Voice of the Church. I'm Bill DeYoung, a pastor at Blessings Christian Church in Hamilton, Ontario. And once again with me today, I have Brian Dijkema, who's the Vice President of External Affairs at CARDUS, a faith-based think tank in the city of Hamilton. And to my right, I have Jonathan Wellam, who's the President and CEO of Rocklinc Investment Partners. They have been joining me for discussions about economics and government in the past. And in this particular episode, we want to focus specifically on debt, talk about global debt and national debt, and then in a future episode, we want to talk about household debt and personal debt. But Jonathan, if I could begin with you, just explain for us what global debt is. I can understand national debt, there's a country that has a debt, but is there a globe that has a debt? How does that work? What are we talking about in terms of global debt?
Well, you start with the nations and then you just add them all together and you end up with this rather large global number, if you will. And basically, when we're talking about global debt, people can understand debt. Most people have had debt or they've borrowed for a home and so on. You're talking about national debt, so at the government level. You're talking about corporate debt, and you're also talking about personal debt. So there's sort of three levels in a simplistic way of looking at that. And if you go back to, I'd say, 1970s, you go back to the 1970s, and why go back to the 70s? That's when things after World War II, the debt had come down after, many of the nations were fighting the world wars, and so there were high debt levels. They'd come down quite a bit back into the 1970s. And they were at fairly reasonable levels. And I say reasonable, debt versus income, ability to pay for it, debt versus GDP, gross domestic product, the size of the economies. But in the 70s, if you look at all the charts, everything started to crank up in terms of debt. Some people tie it to the loss of the gold standard, where we didn't tie our currencies to gold, and therefore you could add a lot of money supply and debt wasn't as controlled and so forth. You can get into a big discussion there. But whatever the rationale from just a pure economic perspective, we started to pile on a lot more debt. And I think it gets to the ethical and moral issues too. People started living beyond their means. Government started promising things that they really couldn't deliver, but people wanted to hear when it came to election time. And so if you go back and you look at the 70s up until now, the global debt at all three levels has compounded at between 6 to 7% a year. So if you use the rule of 72, and in finance you have the rule of 72, you divide 72 by the growth rate or the interest rate, then you can find how many years it takes to double. So if you're doing 6 or 7, you're basically doubling almost every decade. And so from the 70s up until now, you've got this global debt that's just continued to grow at very high levels. So 20 years ago, the total global debt was about $70 trillion US. Today it's about $250 trillion in the last 20 years. Since the global debt crisis, which we all know about in 07, 08, 09, started in 07, it really reached a peak in 08, 09. Our debt has gone from about 170 trillion at that time to 250 plus trillion. And so over the last 10 years, we've gone from having a debt crisis to actually solving the debt crisis by just going into more debt. And so we have a real problem internationally where the money system, the global central banking system has facilitated, this massive growth in debt. And that's been, largely made possible at the same time as you've brought interest rates down. And so you've had this manipulation of interest rates where the central banks have had this very strong influence on interest rates. And interest rates have gone down from, as we know, I remember back in the 80s, even I remember in the 80s, 15% mortgages, 12% mortgages. You've had this drop of interest rates from into the teens all the way down to practically zero. And in some cases, if you look at Europe and Japan, you've got negative interest rates. So you have this massive buildup in debt as people have lived beyond their means, as governments have made all sorts of promises and spent money that they don't have. We've forward spent basically what we don't have today. And you facilitated that by just taking the interest rates down to virtually nothing. We're getting close to the end now. And that's the concern people should have, that you can only push this thing so far. And eventually you've got so much debt that even with zero interest rates, it's too large. And that's pretty pathetic, right? So that's sort of where we're at. We talk about the global debt and just how fast it's grown. And if you want a couple of quick measures, back in the 70s, the average, and if you look at Canada, but this is true in a lot of the sort of the Western world, the debt to income. So the amount of, if someone had $100,000 in income, they wouldn't have had that maybe in the 70s. That's quite a bit of money. It was about 40%. So they have $40,000 of debt to 100,000 income. Today in Canada, Australia, Switzerland, some of the countries in Europe, we have 170 to 180% debt to income. So that's gone from, if you keep the 100,000 the same income, it's gone from 40,000 debt to 180,000. That's just on the personal side. And so, and then when you look at nations, a lot of the nations have gone from debt to GDP ratios, if you look at the total debt to the size of the economy, and you include all three components, government, corporations, and people. We've gone from 100% debt to GDP in terms of the whole society. Most of our Western worlds are running at least 400% debt to GDP now. That does not include unfunded liabilities. So all of the pensions and healthcare promises that have been made. So that just gives, I'm just giving you big picture numbers just to give you a sense. This is a big issue, and you can tell we're near the end of it because interest rates are so low and they can't put them up. And when you can't put interest rates up to even compensate for inflation, you got a big problem.
Well, it makes me wonder what the solution is to this. The problem seems insurmountable, and here we have an investor talking negatively about lowering interest rates, but as a homeowner, I get very excited about low interest rates.
Well, are you paying off your debt, or are you using it to get a nice car?
Great question.
Right. Yeah. So that's the question. The other thing, just to add on to Jonathan's, and I'm sorry I interrupted, but one of the things that Jonathan sort of alluded to, but didn't get at right at the heart, is that we haven't seemed to learn our lesson. That, I think, is the biggest challenge. Yeah. It's that we've had a number of crises. Mexico happened, I think, in the 90s, 2008, and we haven't dealt with the sort of restructuring that we needed to do. We've socialized the costs. We haven't let the people, I think in general, the people responsible for those things, making those bad bets, sort of blowing that up, we haven't let them pay the cost of it. And so
in some cases we've given them promotion.
Indeed.
And given them more say in the economy.
And so what
precisely was the problem in Mexico? What are you referring to there?
It's a similar situation to what happened in 2008. There was an investment in a sort of blowing up of credit without the actual assets that were in line with it, and so it fell apart. And what ended up happening is the government bailed them out, bailed out Wall Street, and so Wall Street says, well, hey, we made a really stupid bet, and we didn't have to pay a thing. In fact, we're coming out like bandits. So why don't we do it again? And they did. And in 2008, you saw
well, even
that
before 2008, there was the Far East crisis. It was the emerging market crisis in the late 90s. And so, I mean, Brian's exactly right. You go back in time, and almost every 8 years or so, there's some kind of problem. And that's because you get abuses, easy money. People get carried away with it. In many cases, whether it's the bankers or it's Wall Street, they fund something and it's easy money. Let's keep it going, keep it going. But whenever you're talking about debt, you have to have collateral. You have to have some equity behind it. So debt is not bad in and of itself if it's wisely used. But if you're setting it free from collateral and responsibility in an asset, then it can just swell and get out of hand. And that's what we're seeing now, where basically you're talking about a global economy. When you think of a global economy, global GDP is around 75, 80 trillion, and yet you've got debt that's approximating close to 300 trillion. You don't have the productive capacity to pay proper interest on the debt. And that's why they've got to steal from savers now to reward debtors to keep the game going. So you're quite right. As a homeowner, absolutely, as Brian says, take advantage of the low rates, build your equity in your house as quickly as possible. That's not what people are doing. They're just keeping, buy a bigger house and spend more money. So.
Interesting. So I'm not very good at math, but this seems to be a big problem. I wonder, are there particular nations now in the global economy that are big culprits? And are there others that are more victims? Can you think of a nation that's actually doing things quite responsibly, that isn't contributing to global debt? Or is this just a game that everyone's playing?
Well, what I would say in terms of the abusers, interestingly enough, it's the countries that have been the wealthiest, most blessed, the Western nations, if you will, European countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, and so on. the countries that have been the wealthiest can automatically go back to the trough the most, right? So they are abusing the situation the most, tragically. So in some cases, we think we're wealthy, we think we're very prosperous, but behind our balance sheet is a lot of debt. So I think the most abusive countries have been the large, prosperous countries over the last 100 years who have allowed themselves to rack up the debt. And in many cases, there's democracies of some sort, depending on how you view how democratic our countries really are. But the reality is the voters want more, and the governments are paid to give them more and make more promises. So the incentives have all been there. Plus, as we saw in Mexico and a lot of other countries, as the money flows, if you can make money by flowing money into an economy, it'll keep going, it'll keep going, it'll keep going until there's a bubble, until it breaks. So I think the most irresponsible countries really have been the wealthiest countries.
But aren't the wealthiest countries also loaning money to third world countries to help them?
Well, we should be doing more of that on a market level, in my opinion. There are certain countries where, so say for instance a country is developing, and we'll give an example of that, and say the East Africa. There's a need for infrastructure. So let's say you want to build a water treatment plant, right, in Kenya. Well, water treatment plants don't come cheap. They're hard to pay for in cash, right? And so what ends up happening is that there's a need for funds to do that. I would say that Western countries, partially because of our understanding of aid, at least in the 1900s, have done a very poor job of that, of actually they have not lent in ways that would encourage business growth so much as I think make people dependent upon handouts. So in some ways, I wish that our governments would be investing more, looking for returns in those countries. And frankly, internationally...
But didn't you say earlier that governments aren't very good in the economic realm? They should leave that to private enterprise? What exactly are you talking about?
I should instead of governments, I should say countries. So
Okay.
like Canadians should be investing in places like Nigeria and Kenya, and so that actually have tremendous potential if you look at what's involved in them. But we also do spend money on aid, right? There's a tremendous amount of money, and I'm not sure that there's a need for that funding for catastrophes and so on. But if you're looking for long-term economic development, the best thing to do is to invest. And so I would say yes, ideally you would have private investors in those cases, but sometimes the risks are too high, and there may be a need for other ways to do that. Yeah. China's done that.
They're risky countries often. Yep. So it is problematic sometimes if you are a business and you're subject to shareholders and they're saying, what are you doing with my capital? Am I getting a return on it? But Brian just quickly mentioned China. There's a country that I think is using its influence adversely in the long run, because they don't trust the Chinese government, to put money all through Africa, South America, different places where there are needs for capital, and they're fulfilling those needs, and they're leveraging. It's almost like a recolonization in some cases in terms of what China's doing. And that's a risk for us in the Western world, again using that term, sort of the more the free market economies, because China then is getting a leg up in some of these countries, which are very rich and have tremendous opportunities over the long term, and they're willing to take those risks. So that'll be a bit of a challenge over time.
There's a proverb in Scripture that says that the borrower is the slave of the lender, right? And I think we can all feel that a little bit. You feel like you're a slave to your mortgage payments, right? A lot of people talk that way. If people, and we'll talk about this in the whole household one, but that's true on a global scale too, that there are obligations. Money doesn't come without strings. And in international cases, China has provided capital, whereas the Western countries have sometimes just provided cash with other types of strings that weren't investing in the actual. And that's a challenge, particularly when you have a country that's not as committed to I would say, a fair and just market. They certainly are a free market in some ways, but that also, I would say, constrains some other very important freedoms, like freedom of religion and so on. But there's all kinds of interesting stuff going on there. We can talk about that in another episode.
Well, Jonathan, you're not a prophet, but what are the long-term implications of this escalating global debt? I mean, it can't just go on forever, can it?
No, what
is going to happen?
What's not sustainable will not be sustained, and that's the big question. How long can, in this case, the central bankers who are having a major influence on this, keep increasing the money supply. Just to back up a second, I mean, since the financial crisis in 08, say this was put at 08 up until today, there's been at least 25 trillion US dollars printed, new digital money added to the system to keep it afloat. If you add up all of the printing from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of China, the Swiss Bank, and so forth. And it tells you, again, what they're doing is, the global financial economy is on life support, basically. So the issue is how much money printing can you do? How low can you get rates to keep the game going? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do know that the only way to ultimately solve it is you've got to reduce the level of indebtedness. And the only way you can reduce the level of indebtedness, there's two ways. Either you have massive deflation and you just write it off, which would be catastrophic, I mean, very difficult impact on the global economy, or is what the central bankers are always trying to do, and that is inflate it away. So you create an inflation rate, and if you can grow, if you can inflate the debt and so forth, 2, 3, 4% a year, and then you can make it more, smaller, more manageable. I just think it's so large now, though, that we're going to have some discontinuity, and that's why we tell investors, you better make sure you hold a lot of hard assets. I mean, first of all, trust in the Lord and have your confidence in Him.
And keep your butter dry.
And so forth. But, I mean, again, realistically as Christians, that's where our hope is and that's where our confidence is. But when you're investing, you want to make sure you own hard assets. You want to own real estate. You want to own hard, infrastructure assets. You want to own essential, scarce resources. If you just own financial assets and paper assets, those can vanish very quickly, as we see if you look around the world where there's been problems. So that's why we talk about, again, for clients, at some point they're going to have to make, this will come to an end and there will be a readjustment, and you want to make sure you own as much physical things as possible, which the government can't manipulate or the central bankers can't. But the debt levels are just too high. And what we haven't mentioned, and I'll just throw this in just quickly, is that part of this is you've got massive unfunded liabilities that don't even get factored into those debt numbers. In other words, those are the promises governments have made that their citizens expect, whether it's pension programs or whether it's medical programs, all sorts of social welfare programs that are unfunded. And now that varies by country. Canada's a little better on that than others. If you go to Europe, Europe has just massive unfunded liabilities. Germany, France, and so forth, multiples of the debt. And so then you overlay a demographics issue, an aging of the population around the world, that people have shut down having children. If they, the children they haven't aborted, or with the abortion levels, you haven't had the rate of births, and then you don't have family formation, you don't have the interest in children. You've got all this debt, and you got no one to hand it to. And so these are all coming together, but I think as Christians we look at that and we say, this is the result of sin. It's a result of really systemic greed, self-centeredness, taking the free market and becoming just totally independent and separating us from the ethics and morality that God gives us. And these are the implications as you start working them out. And so it's going to be tougher, I think, going forward. We need to be prepared as Christians for that and be able to adapt as best as possible.
So I would actually share Jonathan's general pessimism, and with a few silver linings. I think the biggest thing that makes me pessimistic is that a lot of that debt is off the books, and particularly on lower levels of government. You're talking about the states. If you talk about unfunded liabilities for municipalities and states, it's much higher than it is at the national level. And
you're going to make me even more pessimistic.
I know. I'm sorry to do that. But I mean, the key thing, and I know you want to get to it, is the demographic issue, right? So it's one thing if you have a whole bunch of new people who need goods and services, who are going to buy, going to work, going to create, and that the people are growing, which is of course what we're called to do, right? This is the multiply part. It's not just finances, it's actually having children as well. And it seems that around the globe, rich and poor, rich starting with the rich, but also increasingly moving into other countries now that even haven't typically, you are seeing declining birth rates. And for a variety of reasons, some of which are lack of hope, some of which are selfishness. There's a variety of reasons. Other reasons may be present as well. And so what ends up happening is that you don't have that base, that sort of growing pyramid, which will, make the future, so to speak. And I think that's sort of signaling a deeper, I would say a deeper malaise that is not helpful. That is actually does not bode well for either the paying off of the debt or economies or labor forces, et cetera. And we're already experiencing a lot of that in Canada. Here's where I'd say there's a silver lining. So we don't sound too pessimistic, like that we don't sound without hope. There's a couple of things I would say. In general, we are still a well-educated, stable, the countries that are the most in debt are still well-educated and stable, and it's possible for things to turn around, right? There is a sense, and you can even see that culturally on the issue with kids and so on. More and more people are saying, look, I don't need to be working 2 jobs to pay for my Beamer and my house and so on. I want to be at home with some kids because it's a beautiful thing. And it's not just women, it's men and women sort of readjusting their expectations, which I think is at some point, the promise of mammon, right? If we want to use that sort of that loaded term, is that the check bounces, right? So everybody's writing a check of hope to money and the things that it can give it. But the reality is at some point that check bounces. Now, there's some hard things that come out of that, but I think increasingly these days, more and more people are realizing, what am I doing? Why am I in the midst of this rat race? Why am I working 80 hours a week so I can keep up payments on my Beamer and my Gucci? Wouldn't it be better to have a couple of kids, to go for hikes, to do that? And I think there are some indications, at least culturally.
And you've also had a move among millennials towards minimalism, tiny houses, and that sort of thing.
And just one way of looking at the demographic issue, you need 2.1 children per woman to maintain a stable population. So we're running almost half that in most of our countries now, including the US in most recent data. You're starting to get down to 1.2. So in 4 generational turns, you go from 100 to 12 and a half people. So it's massive. So you have a massive reduction in population. Japan right now has they're actually shrinking. There's many more deaths than births in Japan, and they're seeing, their birth to death ratio now is about 0.8. So it's serious. China, of all things, this is again the global stresses. China back in 1979 did 1 child per family policy. Now it's taking effect. It takes about 30 years. And they've already peaked. Their maximum labor force is peaked already, and they're in massive decline. This is why they're very concerned. Their economy is at huge risk because of the declining number of workers, and then you have all the older folks. So it's a big problem. I would say, again, as a Christian, you cannot look at this, I don't think, apart seeing the judgment of God on our nation and on our country, for its rejection of Him, its turning from Him. Romans 1 makes this very clear, and we've turned from a natural affection, and He's turned His back. So if we are going to change this, it'll be repentance, and it'll be a revival. If we don't have a spiritual revival in this country, people don't care about children. The devaluation of life is at the highest level we've seen it in the Western world in hundreds of years. And so it's a big spiritual problem. I think you've got to tie the economics and spiritual together, or you just don't get it.
Mm-hmm. So can I just respond on that? I think there's a couple of things to know. One is that I think we got to be. There's a couple of things to say. One is religious people actually are the outliers when it comes to having children, and I think there's a couple of ways to go about it. We can speak. There's the judgment and so on. I think the other thing, probably the more fruitful thing in our culture, is to show people what a joy it is to actually have kids, to actually to love them. That you're increasing the capacity for love, right? When you're having children, and this is why God made us, right? So that He made us not because He was lacking anything, but because His love is so infinite that to create another thing to love would grow that love, and which is of course right? Like there's an infinite capacity of God to love. And the same thing is true for a parent. When you have children, you have one child, of course you love that child. You have a second child. Is your love diminished in any way? No, it's not, right? It's grown again. And I would say that that's true also for members of various communities that you mentioned. There is a sense in which I would say that we do need to, if we're talking about Christian responses to these type of things, we need to show the beauty and the capacity and the infinite nature of love, and that can be expanded for, say that to certain communities that even aren't having children. We need to be bringing people into families, whether they're gay, straight, whatever. Bring them in and say, look, we can love one another. That's the Christian definition of a family, right? It's a redefining of it from the blood relations that the Romans were very keen on to an expanded version. And I think that when people see that, and when people experience it, when they walk along, Christians who are having families, who are welcoming people into their families to eat, to drink, and so on, they see that it's more beautiful, and the capacity for life and hope is expanded in ways that the rat race of working for the beamer, working for yourself, does not fulfill. And so it's a way of I think it's an important way of reminding our culture that we needn't always look and just say, do this, do this, do this. Although I think there's a time for that, but you need to show that love is possible, and that has economic consequences.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question.
And my point there, Brian, is that I agree 100%. We are to live it out. Having a family is a tremendous gift from God. Children, there's no greater blessing aside from salvation. And then we want to make sure that we're teaching our children. But we have to have a good diagnosis of the culture that we're in. It is a culture that is a difficult one, and we need to live that out. And so I just don't want to. We need to have a good diagnosis of the challenges. That's all.
Absolutely. So we're approaching the conclusion of this episode. I wanted to ask a final question. You talked about casting this beautiful and compelling vision of what the Christian life is like. Isn't part of that forgiveness? And you have this institution, the year of Jubilee, and the Old Testament debts were forgiven. Should we forgive third world debt? Would that be a good expression of the gospel and something that's part of this compelling Christian vision?
So that's a very good question. It's one that a lot of Christians have brought up. People, as diverse, we were talking about Bono, our favorite sunglassed U2 star. You mentioned N.T. Wright, who's a very good, thoughtful biblical scholar. I think there's a couple of levels at which, we've talked earlier about how what is said to the people of Israel is not necessarily the same thing, that we can't take it one for one today. And I would say that that's one of the challenges that they're running into. If we were to suddenly write off all the debt, there would be real consequences that would actually probably harm the poor more than if, I actually genuinely think that if we were to just write that off, it would, if states were to write off all the debts, if a lot of the sort of major banks were to write off significant debts, there'd be real challenges economically, and the poor would probably bear the brunt of it. So I would say to Tom Wright and to Bono, love your spirit, but you may want to give that some hard thought. And again, there's the different levels between state debt, the big banks. It's again a different situation. We'll talk about this in hopefully a future episode of, if your brother at your church owes you a couple grand, maybe there's a way you can, you know what I mean? There's different levels. Let's just be a little bit careful and thoughtful about how we do that. One quick thing to note, though, is that there have been instances where I would say powerful countries in the West have lent with terms and conditions and in situations where, I won't call it predatory, but I will say where there's certainly an imbalance in the relationship in such a way that it was unfair. And I think that's true in certain places with China as well. And whenever there's an imbalance in an economic transaction where one party has significantly more power, it runs the risk of being abused. And I think there has been instances, and we may want to look at whether or not we can address that and whether we can address that with financial means. The ideal financial transaction is one that is made between equal parties with equal information. And I think there's been some cases where that's not true.
And also in some of those cases with the third world countries, I'm not a big one. I'm just saying, again, blanket debt forgiveness. But there could be cases where a portion is based upon responsibility and action. The idea should be to help the countries to be able to become productive so they can actually be self-sufficient. So it'd be better to do investments in those countries and then help them become self-sufficient. And in those cases, reducing debt, making it more manageable for them. I mean, that's what happens on a personal level too. If you are over your head, often banking institutions will work with you, but just to forgive it often will just create other problems in terms of reoccurrence of debt in the future and so on. And what you're trying to do is really help so that this will never happen again, and they see in responsibility along with the debt. So some other thoughts.
Well, that concludes our episode on global and national debt. We will have an episode in the future dealing more with household debt and personal debt. I want to thank my guests, Jonathan and Brian, for a very stimulating conversation.